is front of mind for CHP. But towards the new National Housing and Homelessness Plan edition of Parity includes many important contributions that advance the public discussion about the plan. And can I just thank all the contributors to this edition, and a particular big thanks to the sponsors of this edition, to Homelessness New South Wales, Micah Projects, the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness, Mission Australia and Shelter Western Australia. A number of the articles in the edition talk about the different groups who experience homelessness and their specific issues, and have argued that without understanding difference, we cannot effectively prevent or respond to homelessness. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in today's session, and we'll hear from each of our presenters and then plenty of time at the end for some discussion and to hear your questions and points of view. But before I introduce our first panel member, Trish, who's going to talk about the importance and unique experiences of children and young people, I'd just like to say a few words about people who've got a few more years under their belt. The organisation that I work for, Wintringham, is solely focused on housing and support for older people. Founded on principles of social justice, Wintringham's all about providing options for people to age with dignity. And we know that older people who are experiencing or who have experienced and repeat homelessness over a long time are really vulnerable. We know that many will have experienced multiple traumatic events in their lives, and we know that they are more likely to have a chronic illness or a disability. We also know that while this group's in a minority of all people experiencing homelessness, they're a very high user of services, as they tend to cycle in and out of homelessness, insecure and unsafe accommodation and rough sleeping. They're likely to be disconnected from family and community, and may have over the years developed coping mechanisms and some behaviours that are very difficult for services to respond to. This is partly because of the incidence of premature ageing and the resultant complexity of support and care needs that come with that, and partly due to the life experience that have been endured over a very long period of time. It can often lead to an overwhelmingly strong need for independence and a learned mistrust of services. We know that supporting older people who've been without a home on a long-term or recurring basis is a specialist skill and requires a specialist response. Many older people are also eligible for aged care and other services that complement those supports that we can make available in the homelessness service system, such as NDIS and home-based aged care. So it's critical that the plan acknowledges this and includes specific strategies to address the unique challenges that older people face. So that said, let's move into the younger end of the age spectrum, and let me introduce you to Trish Connolly. Trish is the CEO of New South Wales Youth Homelessness peak body YFoundations. Trish has worked in homelessness and domestic abuse policy, research service design and service system reform, both the Australian and UK. Trish is going to share with us her thoughts on the need for a standalone national child and youth housing and homelessness strategy. So welcome, Trish.
Thank you for that introduction, Jane, and thank you, Kate and Jane, for inviting me to talk about this really important issue. Can everyone see the screen, the presentation?
Yes, but with your presentation slides. So I think if you click from beginning at the top.
Great. How's that? Oh, we had a practice run and everything.
We can see the slide, it's great.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to waste time doing that. And excuse my croaky voice, I just seem to be talking a lot the last couple of weeks, and I've got this, voice like this. But anyway, look, thank you. I'm going to talk about an article that myself, I co-authored with Dr. Catherine Robinson and Shauna Moore. Catherine's from the University of Tasmania and Shauna's from the Melbourne City Mission. Our article was calling for a standalone national child and youth homelessness and housing strategy. Can everyone see that next slide? How's that one?
Yes.
Sorry about that. So we got a graphic artist to sort of knock up this tile on the right-hand side, and I think it really represents what child and youth homelessness can look like for someone on any given night. where a young person is trying really hard to get a bed, and the options that they have is either couch surfing. They know there's no bed at the refuge for them. We're going to go into the data about that more further down. And in some circumstances, you know, they know that home isn't safe for them. And I think the lack of services and the absence of the policy to tackle child and youth homelessness only reinforces their belief that they're not experiencing homelessness. And I'm going to include domestic and family and sexual violence within there because of the national plan that has come out recently. I think what I find comes out of this tile is the resilience of children and young people. And that often hides the extent of the issue. They generally will find somewhere to stay that night, wherever that is, if it's couch surfing, if it's, you know, going back home to a violent home, or in some very small circumstances, the data is low, sleeping rough. But what I'm going to talk about is the lack of services and policy, and the resilience of young people is what contributes to the issue of them being absent in many of the plans. I want to look at the stats and this is the statement that I've made about the lack of services and accommodation for young people. We're not using any of the census data anymore now because it's just too old. When they bring out the 2021 data, we'll start using it, but we stick to the SHS data at the moment. And bearing in mind, SHS data only captures those people who turn up to a service. It doesn't capture the actual numbers of homelessness. So just bear that in mind when we're going through this. So we know nationally 51% of young people, and when I'm talking about young people as well, I'm talking about 15 to 24-year-olds. That will be, unless I say otherwise, that is the age cohort that I'm talking about. So 51% of young people who tried to get into a crisis accommodation in 21, 22 were turned away because services were at capacity. That is a young person trying to get a bed. Over 1/3 of young people presenting alone to a homelessness service had experienced DFE. Almost half of the young people presenting alone to a homelessness service had a mental health issue. And 46% of young people presenting alone to a homeless service needing long-term accommodation, only 3.9% of those received accommodation. Almost 1/3 of the young people presenting alone to a homelessness service were couch surfing at the start of their support. And we know Anglicare puts out yearly reports about the rental affordability, and it showed that someone on youth allowance, and this was last year, and the situation is way worse this year, there was only one affordable rental property available across the country. One thing I need to clarify here, when I'm talking about young people, children and young people, I'm talking about children and young people who are unaccompanied, and that's the language we use when they turn up to an SHS service on their own, specialist homeless service on their own, or they're experiencing homelessness on their own. So if they're experiencing couch surfing, rough sleeping, living in severe overcrowding, I'm not talking about children and young people who accompany or go into a service or experiencing homelessness with their guardians or caregivers or parents. It's about children and young people who are on their own. When we talk about the absence of policy to tackle the most prevalent types of homelessness for children and young people, I want to raise two things. We've done reviews of all the state plans, state housing and homelessness plans, and in every one of them, shows that the initiatives for children and young people are early intervention, their youth foyers, or their young people exiting out of home care and supporting them on the exits. And we're not denying that this is a huge issue and we're really glad they're there, but there is so many more types of responses that are needed for these young people. And you'll generally find that is it when you go into the plans, and it is when you go into the old national, the NHAR as well. There's nothing broader than that. I can actually talk about this as well in the National Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Plan. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's a graph that's in that plan. It talks about the different stages of domestic and family violence that women can experience. Now, to me, that is stark. It's children, adults, older age. There is nothing about young people in there. And in the plan, it looks as though they tried to sort of go back and include children and young people as a last thought, but they forgot it in many spaces. They're not in the narrative. There's nothing there articulating what is going on for them, and you can tell it was a real afterthought. But the language that they used as well was in their own right. And I know from being in the sector for many years, in their own right generally is the language we use for young people and children when they come in with their caregivers and parents to a service, and that they get a response in their own right. So I think we need to be talking about, we need to get a definition of what they mean in their own right, and maybe use another word, because that is the predominant word that we've used for many years. But the definition is the most important part of that sentence that I just made. So why do we need a standalone plan? Why are we calling for a standalone plan for unaccompanied children and young people, or children and young people who experience homelessness on their own? So the history shows that I've just showed you that there's a range of responses that they're just absent in. They're not there. They're, as I said, the foyers, out-of-home care, a bit of early intervention, it's just not there. It's not articulated in any of the plans, really. Children and young people don't have the same coping strategies and resources generally attributed to adults. So resources, money, connections, family, they just don't, the maturity is just not the same. Children and young people need age and developmentally appropriate responses. And we need to stop the adultification, that is not a real word, but it's a word that we use now, of children and young people responses that replicating adult responses and expecting them to just go along, and that is the response that they get, that the adult responses will work for a child and young person as well, and that continues to happen. And responses as well that require them to accompany their parents or guardians into a service. So that, I feel like we really need to be talking about what it hasn't worked. It just hasn't worked historically. And we're starting to look back at the Burdekin report, and it's still calling for the same things. It's identifying the same issues. It's making the same recommendations. We need to take unaccompanied children and young people out of the national plan and have a focus on it. I don't think a chapter on its own is going to suffice. We need to take them out and have a real sharp focus and have some clear strategies as well. I think when I was talking about the services that are needed, I'll just give you a quick rundown of what we think is the range of services that we think, children and young people need within the standalone plan. Bearing in mind that any plan that we do, it needs an engagement plan associated with it. We need to be talking to young people with a lived experience. We need to be talking to policymakers, academics, before we actually bed down what we think the range of services are that are needed. So we need specialist youth crisis accommodation. That is there, that's for 3 months, but we need an increase in that so young people have somewhere to go that night. We need transitional accommodation 2 to 5 years. This could be an exit point from crisis accommodation because there's not much of that, but that could be supported transitional accommodation as well. Medium-term accommodation is a particular service model for young people with higher or complex needs. They can't go into transitional housing. Again, that's an exit point for some young people in out-of-home care and crisis accommodation. If they can't go into transitional, or they can't go into independent living, medium-term accommodation is vital. There is only about 5 services in New South Wales. There are none in regional or remote areas either of medium-term accommodation, and it's definitely something that we want to call for really strongly, particularly in the upcoming election. We need specialist domestic and family violence and sexual violence support and accommodation. And I'm not going into the detail about that, but children and young people miss out on the resources. And you can see from what I showed you in that graph, they miss out in the policy platforms, they miss out in the strategies and plans. Family reunification services are vital because they actually are, the ones that we do have do work in them mostly, so they're very effective. We do need to have the exiting out of home care responses, and the same with youth justice centres as well. Early intervention approaches such as the communities of school, the COS model, where that's a population-based survey that they do of all high school students and identify those young people who are at risk, those who are experiencing homelessness, so that they can put the supports around them before they escalate into homelessness, those that are at risk, and support effectively the young people who are already experiencing homelessness. Youth foyers is another option, and youth social housing and affordable private rentals. I think the social housing is a big one for us as well, because rarely do public and community housing providers quarantine housing for young people. It just isn't there. We've had a pretty good look, and there's a few community housing providers that do it, but rarely do they do that. My last slide is, and this was in the article that we wrote, and I think it's so important that governments must commit to the high standards for our children and young people, to give them every opportunity to be safe, free from abuse, trauma, and violence, to live their best lives and be given opportunities to thrive and enter adulthood equipped with life skills. We fail to take the issue of child and youth homelessness seriously and continue to overlook these cohorts. It will have devastating consequences for their futures. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Trish. Please feel free to use the chat function for questions, and we'll try to keep track of them to come in afterwards. But right now, I'm just going to pull up my sheet and going to introduce you to Julie Duncan. Julie is the General Manager of Catherine House, part of Housing Choices Australia, which provides accommodation and support services for women experiencing homelessness in South Australia. Julie's got vast expertise and experience in housing, urban development, community services, and in homelessness. And she's going to talk to us about the need for a gender responsive national housing and homelessness plan. So welcome, Julie.
Thanks, Jane. I'm really pleased to join everyone here today. And at Catherine House, we were exceptionally pleased to contribute to the addition of Parity, talking about the national plan. It was very timely for us to tackle the issue of what should be in a national plan. We just recently conducted some surveys, lived experience surveys with our client base at Catherine House to inform our own service development into the future. But a lot of those themes and a lot of that information we thought we would share through Parity, because it was just as useful for informing a national plan. For some 34 years, Catherine House has existed in South Australia, and we've adapted and refined service responses based on the changing face of women's homelessness over that time. We've recognised shifts in the drivers into homelessness, the demographic changes, and the expectations of women have changed over that time. We essentially offer crisis and medium-term accommodation services for women in 3 unique congregate living sites. We have 24/7 on-site services. And at the heart of our model is a women's centre where we provide a range of supports, education, training, health, personal development, and recreational support for women. The Women's Centre being a critical part of our model. As mentioned, we're part of the Housing Choices group of companies, having merged into Housing Choices in terms of having support for what was previously a very small organisation in a very highly regulated environment. Unfortunately, Catherine House nearly lost its crisis program to the state housing and homelessness reforms about 18 months ago. And this is a point that I want to highlight around the importance of having a gendered approach to responding to homelessness. That wasn't a deliberate exclusion from homelessness reform. It was as a result of the fact that that reform process did not have a gendered response. It did not see that as front and centre. What it did was it aligned all of the response for women into the domestic violence service sector. And when we do that, we can miss a whole lot of homelessness. We miss a whole lot of drivers into homelessness that aren't immediately connected to violence. So it's just a precaution. And I think that as we head to a national plan, we need to make sure that we're thinking about women's homelessness from a broader lens and not solely in the context of domestic and family violence. but I'm not taking anything away from domestic and family and violence being the major driver. We just cannot think of it only as the only driver into homelessness. So our position is women actually know what they need from a homelessness service system. We just have to ask them. So we did that in 2021. The themes that came out of that, quite interesting, the 80% of the women that we surveyed, and we surveyed them across all of our services and also all of the other homelessness services in South Australia. So this is just not surveying our own clients, but all of the clients of homelessness services across the state. 80% said that they found their homelessness was a surprise to them. This is because women are so resilient. Women will enter homelessness often in a slow decline. They couch surf, they sleep in their cars, they stay in motels and hotels, they stay with friends, they stay with other family. They'll even stay in abusive settings just to keep a roof over their heads and a roof over the heads of their children. Many women will never actually present to a traditional homeless service, therefore they don't get counted. They're not in the line, they're not in the queues, they don't present there. They often don't present until things are absolutely critical. And it may only be when they've entered into medical care, they found themselves hospitalised, or they're involved in the justice system in some way. What we also heard from women is that their recovery takes time and that the service system needs to have a focus on their recovery. Trauma is exacerbated sometimes by the interactions with the homelessness service system, and that the service system doesn't feel like it's responding to the needs of women, and that it's just re-traumatising them after the dislocation of losing a home, family breakdown, all of the other reasons why they may be homeless. It also told us a little bit about housing first, because we've been exploring the concept of housing first quite intensively in South Australia, having been the first jurisdiction that implemented it. Housing first is not about finding the first house and putting somebody into it. It's actually about making sure that you've got the right support and services around an individual as you house them, and that you should focus on housing them as soon as possible after their homelessness. It's about meeting people on that journey. And it's really clear that in order for housing first approaches to work for women, we really need to tailor that housing first response for the needs of women, so that it is about respecting choice and control. The big theme that came out of our research was about a lack of choice and control. Some women felt that was the thing that they were most saddened about, in that they didn't have any say in where they were going to go or where they would end up. A lot of the other issues around aligning homelessness services for women, a number of women felt like that their specific issues were being missed by the generic homelessness system. The underlying levels of disadvantage around Aboriginal women's experience of homelessness, about ethnicity and how that overlays, cultural issues around responses to homelessness, that they're perhaps not being understood well enough by the generic systems. So we whittled our research down to about 8 key themes. I won't go through every single one of them because we don't have a huge amount of time today, but I'll just talk probably about the top 4 or 5. As I mentioned, choice and self-determination are really the important things that women said that they wanted the homelessness system to respond to on their behalf. They wanted that choice and self-determination from intake to service exit. So not just a part of the process, but right from the beginning of the process to the end. Some of the comments that we heard were, I was in hospital for ages, then they chose where I went, and I'd rather have gone back than gone where I had to go. So women were reflecting that they were not even a participant in the decision about where they would go next when they were able to leave hospital. The second most important thing was that the support that women receive needs to not be time limited. It actually needs to be linked to their needs. Another comment we received is everything is so temporary. You have a few sessions, a couple of months of support or whatever, and then it would end. It was never long enough to help me deal with particularly troubling stuff. We probably hear that comment most of all from women at Catherine House, and what they really do appreciate is the fact that they have some time and space to recover and to repair and to rebuild, and take some time to think about what their next step might be. And this leads on to the next biggest theme, which was that housing placement for women needs to actually consider the entire relationships and life needs of the individual woman. 97% of them said that being able to choose their own home, who they live with and where they live, was important to them, but that's not how the system works. The system allocates them a home. And sometimes if we're approaching things from a housing first perspective, we're rushing to find the person a home, when in fact what it would be better is if they had somewhere where they can stay, where they can take some time to make the plans for that next life. The comment that came through from one particular woman was who'd had multiple experiences in the homelessness service system is, if you end up in an area where you're not happy, you're just going to end up homeless again, and the cycle will continue. Obviously for us at Catherine House, access to women-only service responses and women-only places for connection must be a choice for women in the system. As I mentioned, we almost lost our unique service in Adelaide, not by design, but by accident. And we need to make sure a national plan has front and centre the important services for women. Finally, the point I'll just end on is around all services that are delivering to women in this space needs to be trauma informed, and they must provide services that help respond to that trauma. The comment from one of our clients is that I found the crisis accommodation was just triggering, and it was actually creating more trauma, and I'm not moving on in terms of I'm not getting better. And one of our clients who had been through the Women's Centre said she'd been out of homelessness services for a couple of years, but she's still always connected to the Women's Centre. You'll never find another connection like it. So for us, really key themes that there are other themes there as well, but they're probably the top 5 that we would like to make sure that the national plan is delivering on. And we're really excited about the idea that there is a national plan coming. It's been a long time coming, and we hope to be able to participate in the development of that plan at Catherine House. And I'd be happy to take any questions at the end of the sessions today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Really timely with your research there. Our final speaker today probably needs no introduction to any of you. Kate Colvin is, of course, the new CEO of Homelessness Australia. Kate has for many years been with Council of Homeless Persons, and of course the main spokesperson for Everybody's Home in her previous job. But she's come into the role of CEO of Homelessness Australia and absolutely hit the ground running. And so, Kate, let's hear from you about your thoughts about the new National Housing and Homelessness Plan.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Trish and Julie, for those presentations. So I want to talk about, I'm going to start first talking about the need for an Aboriginal housing and homelessness strategy and explore some other areas of difference, and then talk about integration across whole of government areas of service delivery that's needed in the plan. But before I kick off, I just acknowledge that I'm joining from Wurundjeri country and pay respect to elders past and present. So in thinking about an Aboriginal housing and homelessness strategy, I just like to acknowledge that I've really drawn on the article from Aboriginal Housing Victoria written by Peter Jones, and just pay respect to those colleagues in the sector for their fantastic work. But I particularly want to talk about another report as well, which is referenced in that article, but the report, the Wihiyani Utangani report by June Oscar and the Australian Human Rights Commission in December 2020, which is a report that did a really massive consultation with Aboriginal women and girls and explored what their experiences were around a whole range of issues. But what keeps coming up through the report is issues with housing and homelessness. And I think what that report really clearly shows is the way in which discrimination on the basis of race and gender results in lack of access to housing and then homelessness, but then how homelessness makes women and children vulnerable to other problems that are particularly vulnerable to violence, which then spirals into other problems. And I think we can see, and it's when we're sort of looking at contemporary issues that are in the news, for example, the crisis in Alice Springs, when we look back at the report and women's voices, you can see them talking about that growing sense of crisis that has some origins in housing. So, for example, the women in Alice Springs in that report said that forward planning for Aboriginal people in housing is appalling. It's going to turn to overcrowding, and kids don't want to stay in these houses because there's physical abuse, sexual abuse, no food, all that kind of stuff, you know. So it's forward planning that needs to be addressed. And then the theme was picked up by women from Fitzroy Crossing, which has some similar challenges to Alice Springs, where they're also talking about the housing situation and the supply of homes that's not keeping up with population growth. And they say that means more families are going to end up with nothing, more babies being born every day. With the families everywhere, you're going to have your alcohol and your drugs. And when you're alcohol and drug affected, you don't know what you're doing in your life. There could be all kinds of destruction coming for that family and all those families, and it's going to be a spiral effect. It's going to gather the whole lot and it's going to ruin their whole life. So these are serious, serious things. When you've got more and more overcrowding, you've got more problems and you've got that same cycle that's going to keep going. And there's going to be no way to squash that. So I think from those vignettes from the report, see the way in which the lack of housing creates these other problems, and then those other problems feed back into the cycle. So just as a summary, we've got the discrimination creating poverty and inequality. We've got that then spilling over into inadequate and overcrowded housing. And then that increases the likelihood of violence, sexual abuse, and a culture around drinking, which then becomes people having experiences of trauma, stress, and then the practical day-to-day reality of lack of sleep, which means that everyone in that household, whether they're participating in those activities or not, you know, at the next day, they're not ready for work or education. So then you've got young people who are not in education, they're bored, they're not at home in the evening because they don't feel safe. And then, of course, they're on the street. And you know, and the next thing, you know, we've got a law and order issue in the community. So part of the reason then for coming back to having Aboriginal housing and homelessness strategy is that this spiral of issues and set of issues is in many ways very different to homelessness that's experienced in other parts of the community. And June Oscar in the report talks about also about the solutions that are needed to this set of problems. And while housing is central to those solutions, what she also talks about and what the women whose voices are represented in the report are talking about is that it's not just about housing, because of course that spiral of damage has unfolded. And so it's also about community-led. I should have gotten a glass of water before I started speaking. Community-led healing and support. And a whole set of programs that aim to address the damage that's been created, but of course also dealing with the lack of housing and having appropriate housing. So in Victoria, Aboriginal Housing Victoria led a process to develop a Victorian Aboriginal housing and homelessness strategy and a blueprint for an Aboriginal specific homelessness service system, which aimed to address the complexity and the, in a holistic way, that whole set of issues that I was just talking about. So they particularly focused on growing Aboriginal community controlled housing so that the housing that's available for community members is better designed to meet people's particular needs and managed in a way that better meets the needs of the Aboriginal community. So it's about having that appropriate housing as part of the picture. But the set of strategies that were put forward and what we'd like to see replicated at a national level also talk about changes to the way homelessness services are delivered. And so that homelessness services are more culturally safe, but it's also about providing support to navigate the justice, health and out-of-home care system, because there's a lot of barriers to Aboriginal women accessing family violence services because the justice system and child protection systems get involved and there's a very punitive response. Instead of families getting the housing and support they need, they end up, if they identify that there's violence, end up sort of in the clutches of the justice and child protection systems, and so are unable then to access the support that they need. So without understanding that context and cultural difference, it's not possible to really address the drivers of homelessness for Aboriginal women in those circumstances. And that's essentially why we're wanting to see the federal government replicate what the Victorian government have done and have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander driven national housing and homelessness plan that complements what we would see in a national plan for the broader community. So that's one part of what I wanted to flag and talk about. But I also want to flag that there's other elements of difference that the national plan needs to connect with, because people have different drivers that push them into homelessness. So we've heard about that from Trish and Julie, that age and gender play a really important context to understand why people become homeless, but also to understand what solutions will suit them to enable a pathway out of homelessness. So just to flag for the LGBTIQ community, that often homelessness is a product of homophobia and transphobia. So particularly for children and young people, if they're growing up in families, if they're and those families are transphobic or homophobic, they might not be safe. No, they might not feel safe in those families and then leave the family home. Now, in that context, family reconciliation without addressing the homophobia and transphobia is not going to be successful for creating a safe family environment for those children. And likewise, without understanding that context of homophobia or transphobia, it's not possible to design solutions for those children that allow them to properly thrive, because they need to be in an environment where their educational needs are being met, their needs for home and care are being met, but also where their identity is being affirmed in a positive way so that they can do well and thrive and live their best life. So then lastly, I wanted to touch on, there's lots of areas of difference that we haven't explored today, and perhaps when we get to the discussion part of the agenda, we can hear more from people in the session to capture some other areas of difference that we haven't touched on, particularly perhaps around disability. I acknowledge that we haven't touched on that. So, but I do want to just flag that when the government develops a national housing and homelessness plan, our hope for that plan is that it doesn't just be contained as though homelessness is separate from other areas of government endeavour. So currently, we've just had, quite recently, the government released a national plan to end violence against women and children, which has in it a whole list of areas and other plans or government investments that need to be integrated with the national plan as it goes forward. It doesn't mention the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, which, given that domestic and family violence drives about half of the people who come to homeless services actually being there, it seems like a really significant gap. So there's work to be done, and the government will be soon releasing the first action plan under the national plan process, a 5-year action plan, spelling out what they'll do to contribute to ending violence against women and children. And given that housing was identified by people with a lived experience of violence in the national plan, you would hope that the first action plan says we will deliver, a whole lot of housing and aims to connect those two things. But I think there's quite a bit of work to do to make that be the case. Now, the government's also reforming the NDIS, and we know that a lot of people coming through homeless services have quite a few additional support needs, and some of them would be, quite a number actually, potentially eligible for NDIS and are either participants in the scheme or should be participants in the scheme, but often even where they are participants in the NDIS and not getting their needs met. So exploring the intersections between the NDIS and the National Housing and Homelessness Plan is another area where more integration is needed. Likewise, there's implementation plans under Closing the Gap that need to, really more fully look at the housing needs of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. And then we've got one of the biggest areas. We've talked about all of the complexity and why people become homeless. Often the simplest reason and the most common reason is actually people don't have enough income to pay the rent. So social security policy and the adequacy of those incomes is another area that needs to kind of be wrapped into the plan. And lastly, in terms of a lot of what Trish is talking about in terms of child and youth homelessness, family support, family law, those structures that support the well-being and of families and the health and well-being of children are also important areas of policy to sort of turn off the tap and make sure that we have less people becoming homeless. So I'm going to finish up there but yeah, really happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kate. If you want to quickly run and grab a drink of water.
That's a good idea. Oh no, I'll be all right.
And so I'm going to take you up on the question I think that that you've posed, and I guess we've got a number of people here who have got vast experiences with homelessness and differences. And so I guess we focused today on young people. We started to look at gender and family violence. What haven't we talked about? And that what would you like to get on the agenda, particularly for Homelessness Australia and for Kate to hear? But I guess if we're thinking about how do we make sure that the differences of experiences of people who are either at risk of or experiencing homelessness, how do we capture that? Either raise a hand or use the chat function. I guess whilst people are having a bit of a think about that, I might go back to Trish and Julie and you know, I guess thinking about the whole of government and the different policy areas. I see, you know, Julie, you put a comment in the chat, but I mean, I guess Trish, for young people, what are the key intersections with other government, and what are the other key policies that sit in areas that are not going to be primarily responsible for the National Housing and Homelessness Plan?
Yeah, I think any change and ending homelessness for young people, we have to look at the child protection. We have to look at out-of-home care, education, housing, health. They're just all the usual suspects that we need to play a role in ending all homelessness as well. I mean, we talk about you can design the best service model to respond to any cohort, but if they're complex, and let me just say, if a young person turns up to a service and they're homeless, there's going to be some sort of complexity there. But if they're complex, any client group needs all of those services wrapped around them, getting access to mental health service, drug and alcohol services, housing if that's what they need. And in our case, out-of-home care is that where they need to be. I think, like Kate was talking about, the legal system, youth justice. There's multiple. I think I've named all the big ones, but yeah, I think that you'd have to be, for us, we need to have tentacles out to all of those agencies if we are to get serious about ending child and youth homelessness, or any homelessness, any cohort.
Oh, look, absolutely. We recently were at the hearings of the Royal Commission into Disability, and one of the commissioners asked a bureaucrat, I shan't say from which jurisdiction, but they were talking about that jurisdiction's homelessness and housing plan. And the feature of the week that the Commission was hearing in that week was, of course, people who are in very insecure accommodation or homeless. And one of the commissioners just turned to the bureaucrat and said, "I've read your plan. There is no mention of disability in your plan." And it was such a poignant moment when you just kind of think, where are the policy drivers to start to get some of the change happening?
I think if you go back and have a look at the current national NHA, people with a disability are not a priority cohort either. So that speaks volumes, to not have them included as a priority cohort is really problematic.
Looking around, scrolling through, I'm not seeing any hands up.
Oops. I might just jump in if I could.
Please do, Julie.
I wanted to also talk about, when we talk about what are we missing, and obviously our focus today has been talking around homelessness and how what the system needs to respond to the cohorts that we're all supporting. I think fundamentally it's a housing and homelessness plan, and for me the strength of that will be in fundamentally addressing the affordable housing crisis. There is simply not enough affordable housing to rent or to purchase for Australians at the moment. And so we really do need to make sure that this plan delivers and also targets some of these cohorts that we're talking about. So why aren't we looking at affordable housing developments specifically for young people that they can afford to live in? And when you talk about affording to live in, a lot of the time they have to live on a New Start or a allowance, which we all know is not enough to live on. So thinking about the social security system and how that interacts with a decent standard of living, and how that's the ticket to access housing, because you have to pay for it, but also what the housing models are that we are going to put into the system into the future that actually allow people who have to live on very, very low incomes sometimes for a very long time, like people with disability, older women. What are the housing models that they can actually be sustained in? Because that's what's going to turn the tap of homelessness off. We will never turn it off if that mismatch keeps growing.
Absolutely.
Could I jump in and say something there? I totally agree with what you said completely, and it is something, you know, the lack of affordable housing is a massive issue. But when we're talking about youth homelessness, that only fixes one part of it, and that's hence why we need there is such a difference. You know, young people, they need to be in medium-term housing where they're supported for a couple of years to go on to live independently, and, you know, have their well-being is good. You know, there's transitional housing where they're a little bit more independent, and that, you know, that is where their housing is needed. More crisis services, so they can actually get a bed that night and not have to go home to a violent home, or actually, you know, go couch surfing and you know, end up being exploited or sexually abused, or, you know, being put in servitude situations. You know, housing doesn't just cut it for young people. There's too many other responses, service models that really need to support them before they go into that long-term housing.
Great. Thanks, Trish. I understand now, Yumi Lee, I don't know you, but I understand you're from the Older Women's Network, and I got a few words in about older people experiencing homelessness at the beginning. But would you like to add a little bit of your experiences, in particular with a focus on older women, into the conversation?
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. I'd like to pay respects to the traditional custodians here in Darug country and extend my respect to First Nations women on this, discussion. We get a lot of calls from older women who are distressed about their housing situation, and the issues that they face have been touched on here. I think the invisibility of older women in housing policies can best be summed up in the response of the New South Wales government to the recent New South Wales parliamentary inquiry into the homelessness of older people over 55. We had worked so hard with other organizations in the sector to champion a specialist housing service, much like what those in Victoria have, the Home at Last model, and which is now being implemented in Queensland. And it was just noted by the New South Wales government, when it is so clear that, you know, this service is so badly needed, and reducing the priority age to get on that waiting list, which currently stands at over 5,000 anyway. So with regards to the national strategy, I agree with Kate that you need to look at all the other building blocks around keeping people housing secure. And for older women, that has to start with younger women, with, age, gender, to close the gender pay gap. To do something about superannuation, especially for carers. And the fact that, half of women between the ages of 45 and 55, if I'm not mistaken, have less than $8,000 in their superannuation. So as Kate mentioned, income support will be critical. It should be one of the key planks of the national housing strategy, that people have to be able to pay to live in a place which is safe for them, in a place that is of their choosing, which is close to their networks. So these are some of the points that we will champion, and especially noting what was mentioned earlier, we need to increase the stock of public and social housing. That has to be another key focus. And I think it's really confusing for the public, all these different announcements that have been made by various governments saying, look, this is what we're doing for social housing. Oh, look, we've just, developed something to get 80 places for older women here. It's just not enough. The narrative has to be very clear. We have a very long waiting list for social housing, a very long waiting list for priority housing. This is how much we need to spend to make sure that this is disappeared, basically.
Thank you. And can I share heartfelt disappointment, particularly at the ignoring the reduction of the age to access priority housing for older people in New South Wales. Very, very disappointing indeed. Can't see any other questions in the chat. Kate, do you just want to say a few words about where to from here?
Thanks, Jane. Look, I just wanted to say that this will be an ongoing conversation over the course of the year. So, of course, for Homelessness Australia, the government's National Housing and Homelessness Plan is really top priority. And so we want to have a series of conversations. So this is the first of many with people in the sector and people with lived experience about what is in that plan. So we'll come with ideas and hope to sort of have reflection and feedback from the sector. So just to let you know, I'll add people to the updates list so that you can stay in contact with the work of Homelessness Australia. Also, when I did the intro, I forgot to say many thanks to Council of Homeless Persons for partnering in this event, and what a great edition of Parity magazine the National Housing and Homelessness edition was, and big shout out to Noel, who developed that edition as well.
Thank you, Kate, and absolutely. Look, so I guess in conclusion, thanks again to the sponsors of the edition. I will echo Kate's comments. Noel Murray done another outstanding job, and where would Parity be without you? And thank you to those that contributed, but particularly thank you to those that have attended today. And as Kate's just said, it is going to be a big year of discussion and ongoing consultations. And you know, I think that if we can all find ways to contribute thoughts and ideas, whether it's through the Homelessness Australia links or through other, you know, through State Peaks, and State Peaks are of course going to be very heavily involved as well. All contributions would be, yeah, very, very, very gratefully accepted. If there's no other comments, I might draw a conclusion and just say thank you again. And enjoy the rest of the day.